You want me to move the chair? No. Oh. Over to you, Jeff.
Let's begin with some auspicious verses of salutation from Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle. Enthused by great compassion, you taught the immaculate Dharma to abandon all views. To you, the Buddha, Gautama, I pay homage. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 10th installment of the Jeffrey Hopkins Legacy Series with Dr. Daniel Cozort. My name is Jeff Allen, and I'm honored to be here on behalf of Buddha Center, again collaborating with Sravasti Abbey and Uma Institute for Tibetan Studies. Any donations received during this series will go to Uma Institute for Tibetan Studies. There will be a link in the chat box for donations. This will bring you to the Sravasti Abbey donation page. Write in the comments section when you make your donation, Jeffrey Hopkins series. This will help continue the internet availability of so many of the publications on the UMA website, as well as providing funding for future translations. Professor Hopkins left because of impermanence, quite a few unfinished projects. He worked right up until the end of his life. The updated meditation on emptiness will be out in the beginning of 2024. So, Wisdom Publications has generously offered a 30% discount on the new hardcover version to all participants in the Legacy series. So the code will be good until December 31st, and you'll find it in the link. You'll find the link and the code in the chat box. The code is lowercase MOE 30, the number 30, and you'll see that in there. And the link to actually get the book will be in the chat box as well. So we asked Wisdom if they could do this, and they offered to the 30% discount. So we're really grateful that they did that for us. There will be slides, and slides will be made available after the teaching. They're on the YouTube as well as the Sravasti Abbey website. So you'll be able to find those links later after the teaching. And I'm honored to introduce you to Dr. Daniel Cozort, Professor Emeritus of Religion, Dickinson University. Dr. Cozort graduated from Brown University with a bachelor's degree in 1976. At Brown, he focused on Christian theology and ethics, but encountered Buddhism through the Providence Zen Buddhist Center. He then went on to University of Virginia, where he in 1983 earned his master's degree, then PhD in 1986 under the advisement of Professor Jeffrey Hopkins. At the University of Virginia, as a student of Professor Hopkins, he began his study directly with Tibetan Lamas. He did a year of fieldwork in India, traveling broadly and staying in Tibetan monasteries. And we heard you became quite good at debating white horses and water containers. His thesis was called Unique Tenets of the Middle Way Consequence School, the systemization of the philosophy of the Indian Buddhist Prasangika Madhyamaka school by the Tibetan Galupa scholastic tradition. That later became the famous book, Unique Tenets of the Middle Way Consequence School. And this was your PhD thesis. And then another book, which I believe was your master's thesis, that we're all familiar with, is, and Venerable Chodron mentioned before we came on, is Highest Yoga Tantra. Yeah. This book. And this was so valuable because it introduced so many of us to this hugely complex topic of Highest Yoga Tantra. And I remember the president of our center showing me the book and saying, oh, look, my son goes to Dickinson and his professor is Daniel Cozort. And I looked at the book and it was way above my head at the time, but I tried to muster my way through the whole thing and at least got at the framework of what's going on. And Professor Hopkins mentioned you so many times in the recent classes before his passing. At the end of his life, we were looking at Ngawang Pelden's illumination of the texts of Tantra presentation of grounds and paths of the four great secret Tantra sets, as well as the Kala Chakra rite of initiation you're credited in. We even received John Bel Shempen's incredible oral commentary in our inbox, and I know you're connected to that as well. So I know your interest in this topic sprang from a class Professor Hopkins taught from 80 to 81 on this subject, attended by yourself and some of the other esteemed scholars like Jules Levinson, Guy Newland, Kathleen Rogers, Craig Preston, Elizabeth Napper, Leigh Zahler, and other good company. In 1988, Dr. Cozort began teaching at Dickinson College and continued to do so until his retirement in 2021 after 36 years of college teaching. In his teaching career, he created over 40 courses, curated art exhibits, directed study abroad programs in South India and in England, and made a film about the Vajrabhairava San Mandala. He's the author of several books, including Highest Yoga Tantra, Buddhist Philosophy, Unique Tenets of the Middle Way Consequence School, and you can find in the UMA website, What Kind of Mind and Body is Needed for Meditative Absorption? Jayan Sheba's great exposition of the concentrative and formless absorptions, our own positions. Again, available on the UMA website. And I learned if my mind is the type that becomes medium attached to small things and greatly attached to medium things, afflictions will arise continuously, and there won't be time to exert myself to overcome them. So this is what I've derived so far. So this is bad for the business of concentration, Jayan Sheba says. So his writings also, Dr. Cozort's writings also appear as chapters in a dozen books and many articles. And for 13 years, he was the editor of the Journal of Buddhist Ethics and still serves as technical editor. His most recent book project was editing the Oxford Handbook of Buddhist Ethics in 2018. He is currently focused on the topic of Buddhism and the environment, urging us to see that the reality of interdependence provides us a deeper reason to behave non-violently to others in our environment. Dr. Cozort has taught an online course on Buddhism and climate change, highlighting these points, and has very interesting thoughts related to Buddhist economics, using logic to show the obvious flaws in the current materialistic, self-centered views that hopelessly drive society in the direction of worry. Dr. Cozort also continues his work with Namgyal Monastery, Ithaca, where he has lectured for many years and still gives explanatory tours of the temple. I would like to introduce you to our 10th prestigious speaker of the series, Dr. Daniel Cozort, to talk about the Diamond Sutra on the Four Delusions regarding interdependence.
Thank you, Jeff. Wow, that was quite an introduction. You could probably be charged with perjury. I'd like to thank Sravasti Abbey, too. I think you are a jewel in American Buddhism. So I'd just like to start by saying in this series, it's been really fun to see some of my old friends, and it's been interesting to hear again, about what it was like for others to work with Jeffrey. I'm forever grateful that I stumbled into the UVA program and that I apprenticed under Mr. Meditation on Emptiness. And if you're curious about how I got on this path and about what it was like studying with Jeffrey, from my perspective, please submit a question and I'll answer it later as best I can. Anyway, when Jeff contacted me about doing a talk, I thought immediately about what's been most on my mind lately, namely climate change. And then the list came out and I saw that virtually everybody else was talking about something that was more explicitly connected to Jeffrey Hopkins. And I thought I'd made a mistake. But Jeff assured me that it was okay to do whatever I wanted to do. And so I just hope you're not too disappointed not to be hearing about disintegratedness or remainderless nirvana or any of those other esoteric topics from the work I did with Jeffrey decades ago. So what I wanted to talk about today was our relationship to the earth. It's a huge topic I'm still just beginning to explore. So what I'll be talking about is basically a kind of outline. I won't talk about the topic of the crisis of climate change as such, because I'm sure you know plenty about it already. But anyway, the crisis is happening, right, because of human attitudes. Most of us seem to think that Earth is something that we live on top of, and that nature is something that we visit on vacation, and we don't feel as much a part of it as we feel like we're in charge of it. Polls in this past election campaign showed that climate change was the 10th most important topic for voters. And for Trump voters, it was only 10% of it thought it was an important topic at all. In other words, in the hottest year on record, a year that the UN Secretary General just recently called a masterclass in human destruction, with enormous fires and terrible hurricanes, there's still a vast degree of denial. I think there's many factors for this, of course, but it can't be denied that a fundamental problem is the so-called cultural mythology that separates human beings from the rest of nature. Now, by cultural mythology, I mean that irrespective of one's religious affiliation or degree of belief, almost all the cultures of the world regard human beings as categorically different from all other living creatures, and of course, from the minerals of the planet. The irony is that until quite recently, we were an insignificant animal, but now that we control the fate of the planet, we seem to think that it's all about us, and that it always has been. So now I've got some slides that I'd like to share with you. So I hope you can see that all right. So we're all familiar with the biblical story in which God tells Adam that he has dominion over all the plants and animals and should be fruitful and multiply. This became the world's most influential myth because of the historical accident that gun-toting Christians were the first to sail across vast oceans and enslave other people. As Lynn White pointed out 57 years ago in his amazingly prescient article, The Historical Roots of Our Environmental Crisis, Genesis has been used over and over to justify deforestation, digging up land for crops, and the subjugation of other species. It really gathered steam in the Middle Ages. The propagation of Christianity was hindered by the fact that pagans generally were animists. They believed in the spirits of nature and were reluctant to clear forests, to dam rivers, or to plow the earth deeply. So to break the tie that people had with nature, it had to be disenchanted. It had to be made into mere stuff. Over time, this led to more and more absurd moments, as when the famous philosopher Descartes opined that animals were mere automata who could not feel pain. He said their cries were like a gear that needed oil, nothing more. The idea that we're separate from nature is a colossal delusion, but it's not really a hard sell, as it frees up our natural greediness. To name one consequence of this, perhaps 70% of the Earth's wildlife has disappeared just in my lifetime, part of what we are now calling the sixth great extinction. Still, as they like to say in Zen, although delusions are endless, we vow to cut through them. But how? Well, you and I might answer, teach Buddhism. And I agree with that if by Buddhism we mean its basic principles. But I think that for most people, we have to express those principles in language and concepts with which they are already familiar. I think we've got a better chance at being heard by our friends and neighbors if we talk to them about what can be empirically verified by what they can see for themselves. Now, what can be empirically verified? My shifter's not working. I can't go on to the next one. I'll try this then. Okay, that worked. So what can be empirically verified is pratitya samutpada, dependent arising, that everything depends upon causes and conditions. Whereas emptiness, as you perhaps know, stumps many people, dependent arising is about causation, which everyone can understand. But as we know, emptiness and dependent arising amount to the same thing. Nagarjuna says so. And what is the so-called king of reasonings to realize emptiness? The reasoning of dependent arising. Because things arise from causes and conditions, they are necessarily empty of inherent existence, and vice versa. So I think that the Buddhist investigation into causality is a scientific project. Now, in my classes, I found it useful to discuss a beautiful little essay by Thich Nhat Hanh entitled Interbeing, the gist of which he repeated in many other talks over decades. He had a marvelous capacity for expressing deep and subtle ideas in simple ways. So he began, if you are a poet, you will see that there is a cloud in this sheet of paper. Right? Without water, there is no tree. Without the tree, there's no paper. But then he adds that in the sheet of paper, there must also be the sun, and the logger, and the logger's parents, and the logger's breakfast, and so on. It turns out that if you look deeply, everything is in there, even our minds, since we recognize the paper as paper. Next, he invites us to return to their origins, the logger, the sun, the cloud, and so on, and he asks us what remains. Well, Nothing, right? So in the first part, Thich Nhat Hanh demonstrates the dependent arising or interdependence of all things. Everything has dependently arisen and is part of a system, which is in turn part of other systems. Since everything is connected to every other thing in the cosmos, we can use the term interdependence and employ the image of Indra's net, which is from the Avatamsaka or Huayan Sutra. Now, Indra's net is a magical one, each of whose knots contain a multifaceted gem that reflects all of the others, so that in Huayan they say all gems are one gem. Huayan Buddhism was very influential on Zen, and it tells us that all things interpenetrate. The second part of Thich Nhat Hanh's essay is meditation on emptiness. In the manner of Nagasena asking about whether any of the parts of a chariot is a chariot, he says, is the cloud paper? No. Is the logger paper? No. And so on. And so he concludes, paper is made only of non-paper elements. Paper is made only of non-paper elements. I just think that's brilliant. So a different Thich Nhat Hanh essay called The Sun, My Heart begins similarly, reflecting on how the sun, being central to its existence, because it is the absolutely necessary condition of life, why the sun is his heart and air is his lungs, and so on. But in the middle of the essay, he discusses 4 delusions drawn from the 14th chapter of the Vajracchedika Prajnaparamita Sutra, which is commonly called the Diamond Sutra. The Buddha there says that the Bodhisattva must overcome 4 delusions. Thich Nhat Hanh calls them delusions about self, human, life, and lifespan. We might quibble about how he has translated some terms, but I'd like to put that aside and just use his framework for understanding interdependence. So we've heard perhaps countless times that there is no self. We know that if we search for it analytically, we don't find anything other than the 5 aggregates. But there is a self in the ordinary sense of this dictionary definition, the identity, character, or essential qualities of any person or thing. In the world's ordinary parlance, self is the set of qualities that enable identification, the representation of my mind-body complex that others use and which I myself use for the most part. That self conventionally exists. It is imputed by valid cognition to bases of designation such as thoughts, memories, and physical actions. It's really no different than, say, imputing a table to flat top and legs. What the Buddha rejected was Atman, which means a permanent, unchanging self. But he taught that all things are impermanent. So why make a special case out of self? I think it's because the delusion about self is particularly harmful. It's the sort of ignorance that's at the root of greed and ill will. Believing in the inherent existence of a table is far less harmful. So anyway, right now I'd like to talk about 2 aspects of the self that might undermine our sense of separation from the world. The first is that this self, whose existence we feel so strongly, is a creation of the left hemisphere of our brains. Although that's been very helpful to our species, our belief that it is objectively real is a delusion with tremendous negative consequences. The second is that the content of this self, which we regard as our very individuality, is in fact a social creation with almost no unique features. The material with which the left hemisphere has constructed myself has been drawn mostly from my family, clan, tribe, nation, religion, and now consumerism. So the 2 hemispheres of the brain might be characterized as having like almost different personalities. The right side lives in the moment, thinks in pictures, takes in the big picture, not the details, has no concept of self, and uses intuition rather than reasoning. The left side is complementary to that. It keeps track of details. It places events in a sequence. It uses logic. It's the seat of language. It's judgmental and feels judged. And crucially, for our discussion, is the creator of a sense of self. So it may be shocking to realize that we have no direct connection with our world. The brain processes information and integrates it from many areas to produce a synthetic reality, part of which is the sense of self. The left brain is our great and powerful Wizard of Oz, the con man behind the curtain. We are entirely unaware that it is creating our reality. One of the first presentations I made based on research I did with Jeffrey Hopkins concerned this kind of construction, although I didn't explain it in terms of brain then. In Jamyang Sheba's great exposition of Madhyamaka, Uma Chenmo, the question arises, what happens when a god, a hungry ghost, and a human view a flowing stream? Answer, the god sees a stream of nectar, the hungry ghost a ditch full of blood and pus, the human a river. Well, okay, but who's right? Answer, they all are. They all have valid cognition. We simply have different realities that interpenetrate. We're trapped in our left brain way of constructing reality, so that when we stand in a forest, say, we are experiencing our surroundings in a way almost completely different from the way they're experienced by the dog at our feet, the worm in the soil, the squirrel on the branch, the bird flying through the air, and so on. It doesn't look the same, feel the same, smell the same, or sound the same. These are interpenetrating realities. So language is the tool the left brain uses to make a map of our world. We name everything, and we use language to explain the complexity and relationships of things. Language is essential for creating a concept of a separate self. Children don't have one until they learn enough language. When we teach language, we teach objects. In that way, we teach children to distinguish themselves from other things, which reinforces the sense of a separate self. Unless we explicitly teach children that they are not separate from their world, as indigenous cultures do, teaching them language is sure to reinforce the synthetic world put together by their left brains. Neurologist Chris Neubauer says, the self is more like a verb than a noun. It only exists when we think it does, because the process of thinking creates it. That is, we infer the existence of a self on the basis of the brain bringing together many experiences into a story. Just when we assume we are thinking our thoughts, it turns out to be truer that our thoughts think us. Buddhist epistemology tells the same story. When we make reference to ourself or identify something external, such as a chair, say, we do it by eliminating other possibilities. My first Tibetan textbook was the Collected Topics of Valid Cognition, from which I learned that conceptual consciousness identifies a chair through its appearance as being the opposite from not being a chair. It's a not chair. That sounds weird, but it's important. It corresponds exactly to the way neuroscientists explain that language separates us from the objects of our experience. When we identify things, we apply names and tacitly the definitional features of those things. So when I apprehend a horizontal platform with one or more legs, I think table. In that moment, unwittingly, I have separated that thing from everything else and reduced it to what appears to me. But what I see, of course, is something that does not appear to have been caused to exist by foresters and wood shops, does not appear to have depended on wood, nails, and paint, and does not appear to require someone like me to name it. We take a piece of reality and we separate it into a particular phenomenon. That's our discriminating mind operating with language, tagging something, and thus it appears not to depend on anything else. It appears to inherently exist. So we've been talking about how the illusion of self is a sort of trick played by the brain to make sense out of our experience. But there's another important part of the story, which is that the material the left brain uses to construct our sense of self comes largely from our interactions with other people. We've all heard, I'm sure, that Kamala Harris's mother used to say to her, "You think you just fell out of coconut tree?" Her point was that none of us are independent and separate. We have all been conditioned by historical and contemporary social forces, from nuclear family to global interactions. Who do we think we are? With rare exceptions, we think of ourselves the way others have defined us. Sociologist Charles Cooley said in 1902, "I am not who I think I am, and I am not what you think I am. I am what I think that you think I am." Right? My self-image is ironically what I think my public image is. Well, why is that? Like all other primates, we evolved in group settings. Our species has evolved in fairly large groups. Social arrangements were of primary importance. If you lived in a group, you mated with others in that group. So you lived in an extended kinship group, like a clan. Individuals got their status and identity within the group. If you didn't serve the group, you were a problem, an upstart. In indigenous cultures, this is still true. And in many economically developed cultures, it is still true that primary allegiance is to the group, not to the individual. The social influence on our self-concept begins almost immediately. The brain has 170 billion cells, including what are called interneurons, which connect everything. As we develop during infancy, the interneurons expand exponentially. For instance, because it is important to us within our group to be able to identify important individuals, as babies, we are immediately drawn to faces. Over time, we develop the capacity to recognize thousands of separate faces, even those of people we have not seen for years and whose faces have changed due to the process of aging. We are also influenced by other children, who have in turn been influenced by their families, and we spend a lot of time with them because we are unique among mammals for the length of time spent in learning and play. Indeed, our principal way of learning is to copy others. So in our brains, we have so-called mirror neurons that fire when we watch the actions of others, even if we're watching films or plays or television. The point is, our self-construction involves a lot of mimicking of others. Nevertheless, we continue to believe that we are unique. As adolescents and young adults, we become more preoccupied with how we are distinctive. We might even say that we find ourselves, a word that perfectly fits our belief that we have a singular, unique self. As we think we discover who we are, we come to value or devalue ourselves based upon what others think. A dramatic example of this is that during the rise of social media between 2007 and 2021, the rates of depression and suicide among teens to young adults went up 50 and 60%. Elaine de Button has termed this concern for the opinion of others status anxiety, and has argued that it is really the most important thing to most of us. Consumerism is built upon it. The 1950s expression was keeping up with the Joneses, our tendency to want to look at least as prosperous as our neighbors. Well, with this delusion, I'll stop there. The overall point is that we misunderstand ourselves fundamentally. Our precious self is made by the left brain to be the major character in the story of our experiences. Its content is almost completely cobbled together from our interactions with others. As Thich Nhat Hanh says, the self is made only of non-self elements. So this delusion has to do with our belief that as humans, we are categorically different from other types of beings. For instance, only we are considered persons. Only we can think. Only we can feel a wide range of emotions. Only we can own land, air, or water. We feel justified to raise other animals for our chops and steaks. To fatten them up, we cover the landscape with enormous corn and soybean fields. Our main concern for the burgeoning human population is whether we can produce enough food for ourselves. Well, I'd like to start with a little reality check. First of all, like every other living thing, we have evolved from the first single-celled organism that emerged billions of years ago. Then, for a long time, microbes and primitive plants were dominant. A short time ago, in cosmic measure, giant lizards ruled our planet, and our mammal ancestors were the little rat-like beings who scurried to keep out of their way. We are what we are because the four most chemically active elements in the cosmos are hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. Second, we dominate Earth really only in our capacity to harm it. Plants account for more than 82% of the biomass. Microorganisms make up another 13%. Fungi, 3%. Humans, 1/10 of 1%. Sorry, 1/100th of 1%. I shouldn't overstate that. Microorganisms number approximately 5 million trillion. We're a few billion. Our species is just one of about a trillion. And those trillion have been preceded by 100 trillion that have become extinct. Third, we are not single beings. We are ecosystems whose 38 million human cells, 38 trillion human cells, interact with 380 trillion viruses and 40 trillion bacteria. Ecosystems are comprised of individuals who contribute to each other's existence. We are far outnumbered within the bodies we share with many others. Fourth, like other forms of life, our strongest urges are to keep ourselves alive and to replicate our genes. Like many other forms, we are basically tubes. You throw in food at the top and you dispose of waste coming out the bottom. Although we try to disguise our animal nature, the truth is that we eat the flesh of dead animals, we copulate like other animals, and we form social hierarchies just like other animals. And after we are dead, depending on the circumstances, we are food for bacteria, fungi, worms, and scavengers. Fifth, although we have thought we are the only life forms who can form memories, use tools, exhibit emotions such as grief and joy, all of these distinctions have fallen in recent years as we have come to better understand the Earth's biota. I don't know about you, but contemplating all of this I find deeply humbling, and it provides a rich banquet for reflection when we turn to the question of interdependence. Obviously, like all other current life forms, we exist in dependence on those who have lived before us. And like most of them, we are full of microbes without whom we could not live, and with fungi who will bring about our disintegration once we are dead. We have the most intimate of relationships, an unquestioned mutual dependence. To pursue this a bit further, let's consider some of the relationships we can see. Structurally, we are just like other vertebrates, all fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. From our common ancestor, a worm-like chordate, we all have a segmented spine, a skull for our brains, and many other features. We are very like other primates with whom we share nearly 99% of our DNA. We co-evolved with many others. Before we became predators ourselves, we developed traits to avoid them. And our capacity for cooperation, empathy, the ability to read and respond to social cues, and a strong sense of group belonging all come from that. We probably owe our relatively sharp eyesight to snakes, which our ancestors took care to avoid once they left the forest for the savanna. Our limbic system, where our emotional life is largely housed, is thought to have developed from the experience of hunting. Our two-leggedness may have arisen from the need to have free hands when stealing the leftover meat from a lion or hyena kill. Our ability to run long distances may stem from the need to exhaust prey, otherwise too swift to kill. And of course, our species, Homo sapiens, interbred with other hominids, such as Neanderthals. From them came genes that helped us survive in different environments, boosting our immune systems and enabling us to adapt to colder climates. Darwin noticed that the elegance of the hawk is due to the elegance of the lizard. Each evolved to foil the others. Humans, like all other species, are the product of co-evolution. But we are now the apex predator, and we rule the world. This may be our undoing. Biologist E.O. Wilson suggests that it may turn out to be a law of evolution, that an intelligent species will eventually snuff itself out because it will grow a population that overwhelms the ecosystems on which it depends. So when we delve into it, we see that it is a delusion to grant human beings exceptional status when in fact we are small in number, recent in status, co-evolved with other species, and depend on others, some of whom have domesticated us while we believed we were domesticating them. I'm thinking of wheat in particular. I'd like to conclude this very brief overview relating to human exceptionalism by focusing on some human characteristics that are rather unexceptional. I've gotten most of them from E.O. Wilson. We are carnivorous, so we raise and eat cattle, an enormously inefficient way to get calories. We are tribal. Even in large modern societies, we often split into camps on the basis of religion, ethnicity, race, and politics. We absorb contrafactual beliefs. We idolize charismatic leaders, and we block out information contrary to our adopted beliefs. We are aggressively territorial. We invented the idea of private property, which has extended so far that we now delineate separate rights for the minerals under it, the water running through it, and the air extending over it. We are extremely status conscious. For instance, for most of us, our status among our peers matters more than our own wealth. We are remarkably short-sighted, looking ahead for a generation at most. It almost never happens that a generation will sacrifice its economic standing in order to benefit future generations. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, because we operate on the basis of the representations of the left hemisphere with a narrative about ourselves, we famously believe in imaginary things. I don't just mean the mythological imaginaires, which exist in every culture. Our imaginary things include things like nations, money, and celebrities, and we are often willing to kill and be killed for them. No other animals go that route. We are much like our cousins, chimpanzees. Indeed, one of my favorite books is Jared Diamond's The Third Chimp, which is about human evolution. We have nicer clothes and we have a better sense of rhythm, but we are just as greedy, territorial, and status conscious as they are. By the way, we recently discovered that our brains contain neurons that fire when we see or smell bananas, or even hear the word banana. We are chimps with nice clothes. Among the reasons often given for human superiority are our capacity for logic, our emotional range, and our moral systems. Now, all of these have been shown to be within the capacities of other species. I don't have time to go into them all, but I think we should consider the real purpose of reason. It can't be denied that analytical reasoning must be credited with the incredible technological advances that we've seen in recent centuries. But most of us don't use reasoning for this purpose. In fact, most of the decisions we make are not the product of a chain of reasoning, but are made in split seconds on the basis of feelings. We are not as good as dogs at sensing the intentions of others, but we do it well enough to make snap judgments about strangers that are usually correct. That's a subject of Malcolm Gladwell's fascinating book, Blink. Feelings are a product of evolution. They encode judgments about things in our environment so that we don't have to think. We merely are drawn to some things and repelled by others. For instance, if we see or hear something that might be a snake, we react as though it were a snake. If someone looks at us a bit too long, we may think that they disapprove of us. In summation, we are in the 21st century laboring under a massive delusion about how great and unique we are. This is largely coincident with the delusion about self. There is abundant evidence that ancient humans revered the animals they hunted, and abundant evidence that cultures that have depended on hunting, right up to the present day, have had humility with regard to their debt to other animals. They also revered plants and rivers and hills and so on. But in Western cultures, based on the Genesis story or some variation of it, or those that have tried to banish religion, such as the Chinese, commodify everything our ancestors worship. The takeaway: human beings are made of non-human elements. So we have seen that our concept of self is a fiction and that the self depends on non-self elements. And we believe that human beings are exceptional and different, but it turns out there is little justification for this view. Human beings depend on non-human elements. And now, perhaps the most unexpected reality check. What makes us regard life as inherently superior to what is not alive? In other words, how do we separate ourselves from nature in our very conception of life? I'm going to suggest that it is growing ever more difficult to maintain our bias for life over non-life. It may be the case that things we don't know, don't now regard as living, actually are alive. And we can see that things we regard as living are increasingly melding with what is not alive. It's unquestionably true that we're very proud to be alive. We say things like is such a miracle. Our mythologies always include stories about the origin of life. We marvel that in the entire universe, only we have become aware. This, of course, ignores our vast ignorance about our immense universe. Our main concern in exploring the rest of the cosmos is to see whether we can find life somewhere. But what is it? Definitions tend to be circular. Life is what makes plants, animals, and fungi different from what is not alive. Well, what's that? Some definitions add that life is a system capable of performing functions such as eating, metabolizing, excreting, breathing, moving, growing, reproducing, and responding to external stimuli. But that's a very squishy definition because there are many examples of things we consider living that don't do that, and many examples of things we consider non-living that do, some or all of them. The fairy shrimp is a living being, but it enters diapause, a biological dormancy where growth or metabolism is stopped. It can remain that way for centuries, apparently dead. The same is true for seeds, spores, eggs, pupae, and certain plants in dormant stages. Viruses, on the other hand, are not themselves cells, so are regarded as non-living, but they are believed to be the most abundant and diverse biological entity on our planet. Each of us has what's called a virome. That's approximately 380 trillion viruses, compared to like about 40 trillion bacteria and 38 trillion human cells. In our bodies, human cells are outnumbered 5 to 1. Let's begin with the obvious fact that every particular thing that is part of us is not alive. Life is a series of chemical reactions among our body's molecules that facilitate the processes we just named. Of course, the whole cosmos is full of chemical reactions, many of which are the same as life reactions, but are not called such. And almost everything we take into our bodies and excrete from them is not alive. What we eat, drink, and breathe is not alive. What we exhale, pee, and poop is not alive, except, of course, for the microbes who are going along for the ride. And what is inside and what is outside? It changes constantly. So take breathing, for instance, something that we do 23,000 times on an average day. When we breathe, what is outside enters, and what was inside exits. Some of what was inhaled is integrated with the body, and some of what was exhaled becomes part of other life forms. Is there ever a time when I, the living being, am separate from the atmosphere that enters and leaves my body? And of what is that atmosphere comprised? We simply call it air, but it's not just homogeneous gas. It varies in its composition if we are in a plowed field or on a city street, and it is full of moisture and scents and even tiny insects and microbes. Once I inhale, does this rich mixture become me? When I exhale, does part of me leave my body? Here's an example I always find surprising. Tyler Volk, professor of biology and environmental studies at NYU, asks us to exhale. So please, everybody, take in a breath and exhale. We have all now released about 500 million trillion molecules of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, Volk calculates that since it takes about a year for air to circulate around the globe, by this time next year, at least a few dozen of the carbon atoms each of us exhaled will be affixed to every green leaf and blade of grass on the planet. Every exhalation reaches every green thing within a year. And then, of course, we eat the green things, or we eat the creatures who eat the green things. So we make those same carbon atoms part of our bodies again. Also, although we do not regard oxygen and nitrogen molecules as being alive, our assimilation of them is practically a definition of life. All of the time we are exchanging inside and outside. So how do we make a hard and fast distinction between them? So perhaps they are alive. Perhaps they're even sentient. We can't really know. There's a recent branch of philosophy called panpsychism that explores the possibilities that everything, everywhere, has some sort of consciousness. And if it has consciousness, shouldn't it be considered alive? In that case, humans have virtually no special qualities. Or perhaps inorganic life has no awareness, but plants do. Recent books such as Planta Sapiens and The Light Eaters make the case that plants have memories, such as in Monica Galeano's experiments with mimosas. They may release anesthetics when wounded, make strategic decisions, recognize themselves, defend territory, and share information. We have assumed that sentience requires a central nervous system, but plants transmit information through their vascular systems that changes their growth and movement. Evolution needs to be rethought. It hasn't been totally based on natural selection ever since human beings began to engineer the evolution of some other animals. We call it by the nice name husbandry. Having created the kind of cattle and dogs we prefer, we are on the precipice of human genetic engineering as well. We have already been changed. For some time, we have used eyeglasses, hearing aids, cochlear implants, and other devices that restore sensations. Some of us have mechanical knees or hips. I myself have a titanium rod in my spine. We even have bionic arms that can be operated by thoughts. The Human Brain Project has been working on a direct two-way brain-computer interface, raising the possibility that one brain could retrieve the memories of another, and so on. Most of us rely heavily on electricity, on our cars, on our phones, on our computers. Smartphones have now become part of the lives of humans all over the planet. John McClellan has called us technobionts, a fusion of biology and technology. There's a new movement called transhumanism that advocates technological improvements to human capabilities, leading to our evolution into a post-human species. Present-day humans will be replaced by, quote, completely different beings, who possess different physiques and a different cognitive and emotional world, close quote. Of course, a lot of the stuff we regard as non-living would be integrated with our living tissue. Perhaps the definition of life needs to be amended. McClellan suggests that evolution hasn't slowed. It's actually continuing at a rapid rate. That's because the first non-DNA-based life forms have emerged. They have demonstrated by themselves the principles long associated with DNA-based life forms, such as self-organization, increasing complexity, and so forth. He calls this negentropic activity that defies entropy, the dissipation of energy. In these new forms of life, he includes our new energy, information, and transportation networks, and abstract symbolic systems such as math and music. In fact, all of culture, including religions. When artificial intelligence exhibits self-awareness, a personality, and so forth, won't we have to grapple with moral questions about its existence? In sum, life, whatever it is deeply interdependent with non-life. Life is made of non-life elements. So self is made of non-self elements, humans of non-human elements, and life of non-life elements. So finally, let's consider lifespan. We're accustomed to thinking of it as ranging from the moment of birth until the moment of death. But we're also accustomed to thinking of ourselves as a unitary whole, rather than as a collection of trillions of parts to which a self has been imputed. When we understand ourselves as complex ecosystems, we realize that we are not born all at once, nor do we die all at once. We live and we die every moment. So in our bodies, about 1 million cells die every second. That's 86 billion cells a day, about 1.2 kilograms. Within 10 years, all of the cells of the body are replaced. Just to give one example, our skin cells are constantly flaking off, feeding the dust mites in the carpet. At the same time, new cells are forming. 1 million new red blood cells are born every minute. So when we die, it's only the most recent collection of cells that die, because countless others have perished before that. So even if we only consider the usual understanding of a lifespan, birth to death, there are complications. Take the beginning of life. As we know, before there's a baby, there's a zygote, and then an embryo, and then a fetus. But when does this rapidly dividing collection of cells become a person? If we consider sentience to be the minimal feature of a person, that becomes possible only after the central nervous system develops, after 5 weeks, or perhaps not until the fetal brain develops, after 8 weeks, or perhaps not until the quickening, when fetal movement is discernible, at 18 weeks or more. Perhaps not until the human-specific electroencephalogram pattern emerges after 7 months, or perhaps not even until after birth. The abortion debate is largely an argument about the time to pick as a starting point. We may have thought that moment of conception is settled science, but it's not. It's only been since the mid-20th century, after medical science revealed the basic steps in embryonic development, that some religious groups seized on the idea that human life must therefore begin at fertilization. So life is not a question that can be settled by science. It's answered by culture, and cultures differ greatly. At the one end, Buddhist and Hindu cultures have thought that the consciousness recently associated with a deceased person enters immediately into the new union of egg and sperm. At the other end are cultures for whom an individual is not considered to begin life until well after birth. Navajos did not consider a child alive until it laughed for the first time. Until then, its existence was considered a part of pregnancy. Among some tribes in New Guinea, all children were regarded as female until they reach puberty. In some cultures, personhood is a process. One becomes more of a person with more social contacts. Therefore, a fetus is not a person at all. A baby is only a little bit of a person, and so on. Somewhere in between is the Bible, which can be taken to say that life begins with the first breath of a baby. Finally, there are contested cases. Generally speaking, we consider anyone born a human being as a person, even if they cannot demonstrate sentience, such as the intellectually disabled, persons with Alzheimer's disease, people in comas. We grant the status of persons in law also to corporations and nations. On the other hand, intelligent non-humans, such as dolphins, octopuses, orcas, crows, bonobos, artificial intelligence, or extraterrestrial life, are not considered persons. And of course, rivers, lakes, and forests are not. This is increasingly being questioned. I recently read Kate Bradshaw's excellent book, Wildlife as Property Owners, which makes the case that law already exists to expand the scope of persons. Death, too, can be ambiguous. Does life end at the moment of death? In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, there are multiple individuals whose consciousnesses apparently remain linked to their bodies after death, death being measured by lack of respiration and heartbeat. The body of Paramahamsa Yogananda, author of Autobiography of a Yogi, did not decompose for a month after he was considered dead, according to the director of Forest Lawn Cemetery. And there are many stories from the Tibetan traditions about masters such as the 16th Karmapa, whose awareness remained close to their bodies after death for several days. Indeed, death has a different meaning in the context of cultures that believe in reincarnation, since the mind, or soul for some, is continuous and will take on a new body. So, we have seen that since we aren't really a singularity, but rather are a collection of cells constantly dying and being born, that our dates of birth and death tell only part of the story. And we have seen that with both birth and death, it is difficult to ascertain the point at which persons exist or don't exist. To end my presentation on the 4 delusions, I want to reference the biggest possible idea. Our lifespan is the same as the lifespan of the cosmos. So everything in our bodies comes from the earth, which in turn is made from elements created billions of years ago. Our ancestors are not just living beings. And when we die, our successors will be fungi, bacteria, and soil minerals at minimum, and perhaps other beings. One of my favorite stories about Thich Nhat Hanh is that when he was approaching death, a student told him that they would miss him when he was gone. He said, "Where would I go?" So as Thich Nhat Hanh says, in our former lives, we were rocks, clouds, and trees. Rocks, water, and heat existed on Earth before the first single-celled life form emerged, probably in the ocean's depth, with a chemical process. Brian Swim, a cosmologist, says, "The deep truth about matter, which neither Descartes nor Newton realized, is that over the course of 4 billion years, molten rocks transformed themselves into monarch butterflies, blue herons, and the exalted music of Mozart." Swim and Mary Evelyn Tucker, a specialist in Chinese religions who teaches at the Yale School of Forestry, have called this cosmic perspective the journey of the universe, which is one of several names for a new kind of sacred narrative about the human place in the cosmos. We can see that in human history, people will reunite around a common story, whereas generally they're left cold by philosophizing. Swim and Tucker hope that the universe story will catch on. As Loyal Rue says, human beings must have an epic, a sublime account of how the world was created and of how humanity came to be part of it. Religious epics confirm that we are part of something greater than ourselves. Now, we don't have time to get fully into this, but the general idea is that by identifying with the cosmos instead of just on our role on this planet, we can see ourselves as the eyes of the world, as part of the universe that is conscious, that is self-aware. As Swim says, just as the Milky Way is the universe in the form of a galaxy, and an orchid is the universe in the form of a flower, we are the universe in the form of a human being. And every time we are drawn to look up at the night sky and reflect on the awesome beauty of the universe, we are actually the universe reflecting on itself. This is a special role, but which does not necessitate having an exaggerated sense of self or the pride of being human, is thoroughly compatible with respect for non-living matter, and is open to identity as cosmic beings instead of merely being a type of earthling. I'm sure you all heard of the Gaia hypothesis, which says that Earth and its life forms are a self-regulating system that maintains conditions for life on the planet. It was developed in the 1970s by chemist and inventor James Lovelock and biologist Lynn Margulis. The journey of the universe story purports that the entire universe is self-organizing and complexifying. I think of it as a kind of cosmic Gaia hypothesis. This, if we can absorb it, can shift our identification from I, me, mine to the larger context of which we are a part. David Loy calls it moving from ego to we-go. Joanna Macy calls it moving from ego self to eco self. Once you eliminate the ego encapsulated view of self, you can break out of the shell and see the world as your home, the rest of life as your family. That's true renunciation and the identity of an enlightened person. So by way of summing up, I'll just indicate briefly how today I answer the question, what does Buddhism have to say that would help with the climate crisis? Well, the Buddha's great insight was that everything, without exception, is impermanent. It means that all things have causes. In fact, if we look deeply, we see that everything is part of a network of causes, so that everything depends in some way on every other thing. This means that we too are deeply dependent upon all other things, even though our sense of self, constructed by our brains, gives us the illusion of independence. It means that human beings are not in any fundamental way different from other life forms. Each human being is, in fact, an ecosystem comprised of trillions of life forms. They have some good qualities, but many bad ones. It means that life is interdependent with what is not alive, making the very meaning of life ambiguous. It means that conventional notions about lifespan are also questionable, and it points to a future when our identity will expand beyond the body to the biosphere as a whole, or even to the cosmos as a whole. Perhaps the unfolding crisis of climate will make us realize that we've been thinking about ourselves and our humanity and our lives and our lifespan in the wrong ways. Buddhism points us toward a new way of existing in the world, one where we humbly accept our actual status. Our lack of humility is exactly what has led us to the brink of catastrophe. Humility is what can help us to adapt once things get tough. That and reverence for everything on which we depend. It's ironic that the surge of scientific discovery that has undermined religion and turned traditional ways of living upside down might point us back to attitudes about our relationship to the earth that were characteristic of our ancient ancestors. Okay, with that, I'll stop. I hope that I have presented some ideas that were interesting to you, and perhaps you have a suggestion for me or have some questions.
Absolutely wonderful,
Yep.
Dr. Cozort. Really appreciate it. It's incredible how we create all of these concepts within our mind, and then it just fuels this idea that we have this permanent unitary independent self that is just so exclusive of everything else. And then it's reinforced by all of those things that you pointed out. So it's great when we have these kind of talks to look at the self-grasping ignorance and say, look at the mess that this thing creates. Look at what happens when you start from a place that's wrong, a starting point, and then this arrogance takes over that just disturbs our minds. And that's the part that stinks about it. If it worked and it produced the things that we were looking for, happiness and no suffering, then it would be great. But it just shows, and you've proven so clearly that this lack of respect for everything other than I is just the driving force behind so many problems. And yeah, it's incredible. Geshe Dorje Damdu always mentions the fact that your body. How old are you? I'm 20. I'm 52 years old. And then he asks everybody how old they are, and he says, "Do you agree with me that you're made of atoms?" And then everyone says, "Yes, I agree. We're made of atoms." And he says, "Do you agree with me that all of those atoms are the same age?" And then everybody just has a moment to think about this kind of construction of the I that we create on a basis of designation that we're so sure is a specific kind of basis of designation, even.
Once you get to be 13.5 billion years old, you really don't want to observe birthdays anymore.
Okay, so I have a question. You mentioned that the construction of a separate self comes from language. It's essential for the conception of a separate self. And if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I feel that a baby crying wants food and there's bifurcation I feel without language. Do you mean the crying is language, or this is what I'm feeling like in the womb? Are we saying like without language, there's no conception of a separate self? There's no self-grasping ignorance? Could we all just be take away language and we'd be arhats?
No. Not saying that. It would be perhaps the case. No, I really don't think a concept of self, the kind that we're talking about, could really arise in the absence of language. So I don't think, for instance, that my dog has a concept of self.
I see.
I don't think that the fetus in the womb has a sense of self. And for that matter, the baby who hasn't learned any language yet does either. But what we consider education is we tell you what the name of everything is. And then we tell you, like, no, that's not that, it's this instead. We relentlessly distinguish one thing from another. And it all amounts to an education in making things as separate as possible, unrelated to each other as possible. So that, when I come along and I see this flat top with some kind of support underneath it, I say self. Sorry, I say table, right? I think table. And I've immediately excluded everything else except for that, that thing. And everything, it is an interdependent object. It's a dependent arising, but none of that's apparent to me. All that's apparent to me is its seeming separateness. And, that's what we cultivate day by day in all of our dealings. It's really difficult to kind of get away from it. I'm sure that all of us have had the experience of being in some kind of awesome place where for a moment our mind stopped and we didn't just start thinking words to identify different things. I think, the Grand Canyon might have been that for me, or the first time I saw the ocean or something like that. At that moment, in a moment of awe, you have kind of a mystical experience where that's non-dualistic, and you're not separated from the thing. Why you're not separated? Because you haven't started to think of it as a separate thing yet. Thinking makes you a separate thing and it separate from you, and on we go.
My last question. My dog, when gets under the covers, and when another dog tries to get under the covers, it growls and gets really upset. There seems to be some sort of bifurcation that's taking place when one gets a bone, the other doesn't get a bone. So would you say that's Darwinistic instinct or would you say that there's a sense of self there?
No, I wouldn't say there's a sense of self. I would say that that's instinctual behavior. It's actually the same sort of behavior I engage in when I'm really hungry too. I want to get to the table and eat before the other people get there and take all the food.
I am hungry. Isn't that a sense of self? I am hungry.
If I were thinking I am hungry, yeah.
I see.
Just following my nose,
Thank you.
To the good stuff.
So non-conceptual, pure direct experience that's happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was beautiful.
Could you tell us about your relationship with Professor Hopkins and how you got involved in the UVA program?
Well, I kind of stumbled into the UVA program. I was already in Charlottesville, Virginia. I attended Brown University, and I took a lot of courses in religious studies there because I was trying to thrash through what remained of my Christian belief, having been raised as a Lutheran in Fargo, North Dakota. But I never thought I was going to go on with that. I thought I was going to go to law school. So I followed my girlfriend to Charlottesville, Virginia, and got a job and considered my next move. And once I found that what lawyers do all day really wasn't that interesting, I landed upon the profession of professor as a good job. And that's when I started looking around and discovered that at UVA, there was this PhD program in Buddhist studies. So I thought I would check that out. I just want to emphasize that at that time, I knew hardly anything about Buddhism. I was intrigued by it because I had come from studying Western existentialism. And I came to see what I'd read about Buddhism, mostly Zen literature, as being that Buddhism was an Eastern form of existentialism. Existentialism says first existence, then essence. Basically, that it's up to us to define things and to value them. You know, we impose these definitions and values on them. And you can see why Buddhism would seem to go along with that, right? So anyway, I applied to the program, and I didn't actually do much to check it out until I was accepted. And only then did I go to the office of Jeffrey Hopkins. And he was sitting at his desk, and behind him was a blackboard, green board actually, I think, full of Tibetan. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "You'll find out soon." So I just kind of stumbled into it, and I was just going to try it out. I was, by that point, a citizen of the Commonwealth of Virginia, so in-state tuition was $1,750. It took a while before I actually started directly learning from Jeffrey, although I think I was in a seminar from that very first, from the very beginning, in which he was translating for the resident Lama. And it wasn't so much Jeffrey at first as the Lamas that made me commit, because I was amazed by these people who had lost their country, who had nothing, and yet were the happiest, wisest, kindest people I had ever met. So obviously, I thought it would be a good idea to learn what they learned. And Jeffrey's whole program was a way into that. And then, I saw him do amazing things like translate for His Holiness the Dalai Lama at the first Kala Chakra initiation in Wisconsin, and other things like that. Anyway, so I mainly knew him that way. But when it came to a point to work on a master's thesis and then PhD thesis, that's when I, like others, started working one-on-one with him, having weekly meetings. And I came to know from talking to other people that he exhibited like different personas for different people. The persona he showed to me was actually very nice, very kind, very gentle, actually. And I know he was not that way with other people. I think part of it might have been that, he knew that I was married and was always worried that, the program might be spelling doom for my marriage, because, so much was required. I don't think there's any PhD program in any subject anywhere that required as much coursework or length of theses and dissertations as the UVA program did under Jeffrey Hopkins. I think all of us would say that in the long run, that was really beneficial to us. We were able to finish large works that could be turned into books, for instance, which guaranteed our academic careers. And I think one thing I want to express special gratitude for is that, I went to India 83, 84. And in March of 1984, basically my dissertation was stolen. It was on board a train in New Delhi, leaving to go up to Dharamsala. And I had, months of notes and a lot of stuff in a certain bag. Somebody followed me on board the train. And while my back was turned just for a moment, putting a suitcase under an opposite seat, someone, put his hand through the curtain and stole my thing. And anyway, I told Jeffrey what had happened, and he said, "Oh, well, it looks like we have a lot more work to do when you get home." I mean, he'd already spent an enormous amount of time with me, but we had to spend more time going over stuff that, we thought we'd already finished. And he never complained a moment about, having to do that. So very grateful for having studied under Mr. Meditation on Emptiness, having come from the kind of existentialist background and everything, it just occurred to me immediately, this is it. This is ground zero. This is what the Buddhist tradition is really all about.
Wonderful. Just so wonderful. You had those experiences at that time when there was just those high lamas were around, and Gen Jeffrey was able to get them to come talk, and they're just the kind of the lions of that generation.
And,
so
and should I say, I didn't know how great they were. You know, I didn't know all this stuff about, well, I mean, like Khenser Yeshe Tupten, who I worked with more than anybody else, I think. I mean, he was like the first of the first. And he was the abbot of Drebung Losaling. When I went to India and I went to go and continue my study with him there, he would walk through the courtyard and monks would flee in terror in all directions, you know, because he was too great to get close to. And he was the same person. I would drive him out to Jeffrey's house on Friday afternoons. He would have been at Ann and Harvey's house for the week, and then he would stay out at Jeffrey's for the weekend. And I hardly knew any Tibetan then, but I would try to talk to him and say, "Oh, look, the trees are green, aren't they?" You know, and he was fine with that. He had no, he didn't need to get over himself. He'd gotten over himself already. So
the humility is really amazing. I had the same experience when I went with my teacher, Khenser Rinpoche, to India and saw, whoa, wow, the same thing that you're speaking of, the reverence and respect and people jumping in ditches to get lower. And then here I am with none of that going on.
yeah.
So we learn. Okay, in delusion number 1, these are all from participants. You kept talking about the brain being the seat, cause of the self, but isn't self a concept of the mind? So I think there's a brain mind differentiation question here.
Yes, I don't know how to answer that question, I guess. I mean, the brain and the mind are obviously correlated. In Buddhism, we'd like to say that it's possible to have mind without brain, I guess, you know, because, for instance, the intermediate state being doesn't have it has a ghost-like body, so it doesn't have a physical body, so it wouldn't have a physical brain, yet it has a mind and so on. So let's say this, that the left brain is the medium through which the mind, of course, has to work in a human being or any other type of being. And the brain is feeding the mind its take on the experiences that we have through our eyes, ears, and all the rest, and putting them together in a story. I don't know what I can say that could be any more discriminating than that. I'm sorry.
I thought that was fantastic.
Oh, okay.
Fantastic.
Oh, works for you then.
Mind-brain connection, and just like our eyes are, and our eye consciousness and our eye sense power, all of that connecting and making us perceive. Absolutely makes sense. There are some in the current political discussion that seem to think that the world is facing imminent danger in the form of nuclear war and justify their political policies, agendas, and on the basis of prioritizing a foreign policy that will supposedly avert such a disaster, i.e. they claim that such efforts as wind energy are in fact not optimal. How do you see this? How do you incentivize reduced consumption in a land whose people are embedded in convenience?
Gee, that seemed like about half a dozen different questions.
It did.
Sorry,
I apologize for that. I got in the middle of
I
the
thought at
weed.
first it was a question about nuclear war, but then it turned into really having to do with nuclear power. And then about like reducing consumption.
Yes, it seems like so let's start with the first part. There's some in the current political discussion that seem to think that the world is facing imminent danger in the form of nuclear war and
Could be.
justify their political policy choices kind of around that fear. I think that's maybe the first part. I hope whoever wrote this, I hope I caught that.
Yeah. And then what should we say is the next question?
So that there's policies that maybe to have a planet that need to be in place if there's going to be a nuclear war. Policies that I don't know. I'm reading into the question now. It just says
Right, yeah.
policies agendas on the basis of prioritizing foreign policy that will supposedly avert such a disaster to be able to have a planet.
Yeah. I wish it were possible to have a real functioning United Nations, so that, say, Russia and North Korea and Iran and India and Pakistan and Israel and Britain and France, and there's a lot of members in the nuclear club. And under the right circumstances, any of them could start a nuclear war. I mean, people worry about it happening, for instance, that Iran would try to detonate an atomic weapon in Israel to, finally carry out its longstanding hope that Israel would cease to exist. I don't know really, frankly, what the possibilities of nuclear war are, and can only hope along with the rest of you that it's not ever going to happen. But nuclear energy is kind of a separate thing. And I'm glad to hear that there's some nuclear power plants that are starting to come back. Microsoft is intending to bring back the unused part of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania's 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, for instance, mainly because it needs a vast amount of energy for its artificial intelligence and other sorts of ventures. The thing is that we live in kind of a confusing time where we've been emphasizing up to this point living in a more simple way and consuming less as a way to avert the worst part of climate change. It now appears that, I mean, it's really too late for most of that, and that people are going to continue to demand a lot of energy for all the different things that we do, so that we really got to concentrate on providing that energy, but providing it in a way that doesn't cook the planet. So the cost of fossil fuels ought to be much higher than it is now. We can phase that in. And the cost of renewable energy ought to be very cheap, and we ought to be subsidizing that tremendously. But getting everybody agree to these steps is very difficult indeed. And now I admit I've sort of lost the last part.
No, you were actually right on the end, the last question. How do you incentivize reduced consumption in a land whose people are embedded in conveniences?
Yeah, well, it's difficult to do so. I mean, what I've been suggesting here today is that we might be able to give people a bigger picture that would enable them to see that they are actually part of, not in charge of, but part of the biosphere here, and by extension, the entire cosmos. And that when we treat it badly, we are treating ourselves badly. That's the movement from ego to we-go, or ego self to eco self, that Loy and Macy, for instance, talk about. So, we need to bring people in that direction, but we do have to recognize that consumerism is very powerful. Capitalism is very powerful. It's not going away. Probably the best we can do in the short run is to make it less harsh, which, the Scandinavian countries have a form of capitalism that's quite gentle by comparison to many other models. And the American model isn't the worst, but it's close to the worst, and in the next 4 years, likely to reverse whatever gains it might have been in terms of providing a safety net for everybody. Again, I don't think maybe we should go on to another question because I'm not answering this one very well.
Oh, I think you absolutely did in many ways. Is justice imaginary in the same way nations are?
Well, I guess so. I mean, right? I mean, who decides what's just and what's unjust? I mean, we have systems of ethics and we have principles. And we have, ethical families such as utilitarian ethics and deontological ethics and virtue ethics. And all of them explain differently what it would mean for justice to be brought about, in a certain situation. But, it's ethics is something that we invent. It is imaginary. That doesn't mean it isn't useful. It's quite useful. In fact, the concept of self has been quite useful too. And if any of those other things you want to look at, the concept of tribe, the concept of nation, the concept of, well, whatever names we want to put on the various geographical features of the planet, they're useful in some way. It just helps to, keep in mind that we are making it up. I always go back to the astronauts who say, you look down from space out of the window of the space capsule, and you don't see any of those lines that you see on a map between the United States and Canada and Mexico. It's just all one thing. But we believe so strongly in those things that human culture has come up with.
Certainly do.
Yeah.
What is the relationship between consciousness and life? Is it the same? Is it different? Why does Buddhism deny that trees are semchen, conscious?
Yeah, does Buddhism deny that Buddhism doesn't include plants within the 6 categories of beings, as whom you can be born. But I'll be honest. I mean, I view that as an aspect of Buddhist mythology that it doesn't especially guide my life. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama likes to say that if science can disprove something that we believe in, we'll drop that belief. Science cannot, of course, disprove reincarnation. It can't disprove karma, and it can't disprove that there are hungry ghosts, gods, demigods, or hell beings. But, I kind of view traditional Buddhist cosmology as coming from a different era, and not something I myself take all that seriously. So can plants be sentient? Why not? And of course, this is something that came up a long, long time ago in our seminars. The Tibetan Lamas, once they learned that our bodies are full of microbes and that the microbes are individual living beings, then had trouble answering the question, if you're really sick, should you use antibiotics? Right?
That's a hot one.
Yeah. Or do you let yourself die because you wouldn't want to harm living beings? I think, as the Buddha noted before he went off into the forest even, it is impossible to live without harming other beings. Farmers cannot live without harming other beings. If you just eat vegetables and no other creatures, there's still a lot of harm that takes place. Keeping a human being alive is something that, generally speaking, Buddhism would prioritize, because we say human beings have a better chance than any other type of being to make progress towards enlightenment. And that's a very precious thing. And so, maybe on that basis, you justify the antibiotics or any of the other things. Anyway, to me, it's a very complicated sort of thing to consider as to what is sentient and what isn't, what's alive and what's not, and what our ethical responsibilities ought to be in that case. I don't solve.
Hard.
I'm just bringing up the problems, not solving them.
They're very hard. They're difficult things to answer, for sure. Okay, how do you interpret the logic in the Diamond Sutra that states P is not P, therefore it is P in relation? I don't know what the P is here. It's just, okay, you do, good. In relation to the concept of shunyata.
Self
For
is made only of non-self elements. Is that?
Self is not self, therefore it is self. That's what it says here. I'm just reading this.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah.
a concept?
Well, there is a self, conventionally existing, but it's made only of non-self elements. So that really underscores that it is in every way a dependent arising, and that it is empty of inherent existence, since obviously it depends upon all of these other things. So that's kind of how the logic is defended. I actually thought the question was going to go in a kind of different direction, which we probably don't have time to get into, which is that YN Buddhism, which Thich Nhat Hanh liked. And actually his essay, The Sun, My Heart, ends with the 10 interpenetrations from the Diamond Sutra. It says that all things interpenetrate, that, any one thing is actually the sole and total cause of everything. And it's just asking us to look at the whole of reality and realize that if you take away any part of it, it's not the same anymore. So that I am the cosmos and you are the cosmos, because if either one of us were taken away, there wouldn't be the same cosmos.
Same entity, different isolate.
That to me is the biggest idea in Buddhism. But it bears thinking about, because I think it's basically where we need to go, to think of ourselves in a cosmic way as cosmic beings.
It's wonderful. And going off of what you said before about non-harm is almost impossible, like the Buddha said when he was talking with the monastics, and he said you should strain the water to make sure that there's no bugs in it. And they said, well, why don't we just use clairvoyance? The ones who have clairvoyance will just look. And he said, no, 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 you don't want to see that. Then you're going to see trillions of things that you don't want to see that you're drinking in terms of sentience. So it's kind of goes off of that.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
Actually, I'd like that citation. I'd like that source.
I can find out where that's from. It's from one of my teacher's teachings, and I can ask him for you.
Okay.
And once I do find that out for you, I'll let you know.
That would be great. Yeah.
This is the last question. Do you regard AI, and I saw John Power's hand was up also. I don't know if he got his question in or has a question, but he was so kind to give a talk. I just want to make sure that if one of these questions wasn't John's and he wanted to ask a question, that we addressed that. But do you regard AI as conscious or able to become conscious?
Well, maybe so. It hasn't yet exhibited self-awareness, but a lot of people think it's maybe not really too far away from that. And then I don't, what are we going to say? You can't say, oh, well, we made it, therefore it cannot be a separate thing. Well, I mean, so what? I mean, everything is made of stuff that comes from someplace else, and once it's put together, then you have that thing. And we ourselves, of course, been put together out of a lot of things, and then at some point gained self-awareness. So AI scares me. I'll just come right out with it and say that. This will sound very weird, but when I was in high school back in the 1960s, I developed a speech for a speaking contest called The Obsolescence of Mankind, based on a 1955 essay by Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey. And he pointed out that we have computers now. This is in the 50s. Eventually, the computers will be able to invent better versions of themselves. And that will snowball until, you know, the computer has come up with something that we can't even understand. At that point, mankind will be obsolete. Well, I've been thinking for a very long time that this possibility might be approaching, and I don't really know how we're going to deal with it.
AI is very strange. One of Gen Jeffrey's students took two of the books from the UMA site on compatibly appearing subjects and punched them into, I think, Notebook LM, something like this. I don't know anything about technology, but I was shocked by this.
Yeah.
Punched it into there, and it made a 20-minute, almost news broadcast with two people, a male and female, having an interaction with a voice like a newscaster, and they're having a conversation about the differentiation between Svatantrika and Prasangika and what compatibly appearing objects mean.
Yes.
And I mean, it got some things wrong, but it was also really scary because you don't really, until you hear a couple glitches, you don't even know it's not human beings talking. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know. As still, I'm technical editor of the Journal of Buddhist Ethics. So when anybody ever makes a comment on any of the articles, it comes to me first to be approved. Well, I get a lot of junk, you know, from commercial enterprises that just want to have something appear somewhere. But lately, I've been getting stuff that's been through an AI thing. And what it's done is it's summarized some point about the article. And the language with which it's expressed is quite scholarly. And
Mm.
I have to realize, oh, this is just summarizing that. It's not really making any comment on it or raising any question. Oh my God, this has been done by AI. But, you know, often people are not going to be able to tell the difference between AI generated stuff and that is, which isn't.
No way.
In terms of like our scholarly project of translating Tibetan texts and working with their meaning, AI may turn out to be very useful. I mean, it could be that we'll basically feed a becha into, you know, a machine and it will pop out an English translation that's pretty passable. You just need to fix it up, you know, in certain places.
Yeah.
Or, like you say, take several abstruse books on the same topic and ask AI to process them. And in a nanosecond, the things come back with, you know, something. So it's just going to make such a change in all sorts of avenues of human life.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
It's definitely odd. Okay, thank you so much. I don't think we have
You're
any more
welcome so
questions.
much.
It doesn't look like Professor John Powers is in the meeting any longer. So we're all set with his question. I just wanted to make sure if he had one, we got to it. And I just want to say thank you so much. It's been really a mind-opening experience, and it gives me personally a lot to think about because I'm always just trying to undo this inappropriate attention, this kind of mess that runs around in order to, you know, not have to worry anymore, as Janja Rupi Dorje says, because we've been
Right.
worrying too long and we don't need to. So thank you for helping me learn how to stop that worrying a little bit more. So again, thank you so much. And next week, we have the final installment of the series. Wow, I can't believe that. Number 11. And I'm excited to remind you who's coming. Professor Stephen Weinberger, Vice President of UMA, to lecture on the importance of Yoga Tantra, an introduction to the Sarva Tathagata Tattva Samgraha. So it'll be a very, very interesting talk. And Professor Stephen Weinberger is a really wonderful person. Lori and I got to meet with him when we met with Gen Jeffrey just this last June down at UMA, the last time that he visited there. And he was just a wonderful delight. We spent 8 hours actually talking. So I think everybody will really enjoy that final talk. And thank you, Sravasti Abbey, so much for everything that you do, for hosting this, for making sure that the actual Dharma is in the United States by creating a place for monastics to live and prosper and engage in the studies of hearing, contemplation and meditation. So thank you so much for providing that, and also for hosting all of these wonderful talks that I know so many people have gotten so much out of. Now let's dedicate the immense amount of merit we've created from listening to this pure teaching from the King of Prayers. I dedicate all this virtue to emulate the knowledge of the hero Manjushri and likewise Samantabhadra as well. With whatever dedication is praised as supreme by all the conquerors who traverse the 3 times, I also dedicate all my roots of virtue for the sake of auspicious deeds. Thank you so much, Dr. Cozort. We really appreciate it. Thanks for having fun, and we'll see everyone next week. Take care.
Bye-bye.